thank you all for coming out to our panel. This is Indie Comics in Furry, Bridging the Gap. And it's just going to be a roundtable discussion between myself, go by Yaster Juniper Clark, who goes by Furries in June, Yaster Goodman, who you can find at Tip File Format, and Teo Suzuki, who you can find at Only Cosmia. We're just going to talk about kind of the trends in furry and indie comics and how we have all navigated that space, and field any questions later on. So I think the way we'll structure it is we'll all do some introductions in the beginning, do a discussion, and if we have any time at the end, we'll do some Q&A. There's not another panel in here until 1 o'clock, so we've got a lot of time. So I'm actually going to start with you, and we can pass it back down. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hello everyone. Thanks for coming out so early. I know you had a long night last night, but I'm impressed that you made it here. So hi, I'm Juniper, Furries Online. First, I just want to thank Robyn for putting this together. This is really cool. I'm excited to be a part of it. And also the staff at Furrydelphia and the Sheraton for kind of making this con possible. My presence on this panel, so I'm a PhD student in the Department of Music at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philly, where I teach and research. I mostly study like animality and how like that comes to be understood and like constructed as a concept or a category. And so right now I'm in the middle of writing my dissertation, which looks at kind of the production and circulation of fur, both like real animal fur and faux fur as well, throughout the like 20th and 21st centuries in North America and Europe primarily, and kind of how that weighs on broader conceptualizations of these kind of Western divisions between organicism and artificiality, and humanness, non-humanness, aliveness, deadness, and nature and culture. And so the latter part of that project is kind of looking at how fur is mobilized in like furry and therian spheres as this kind of like queer trans object. So I get to do like field work at conventions, which is kind of awesome. Strictly speaking, I'm not a cartoonist like some of the other panelists here. My artistic practice is mostly kind of in the realm of writing experimental like multimodal pieces, installation art, stuff like that. Though recently I have been doing some work on like zines and more DIY kind of independent publications. So yeah, my expertise in publishing specifically is more on the academic side, so I'm excited to like talk about that in conversation with everyone else here. So yeah.
My turn? Yeah. Hello everyone. My name is Yaster Goodman, aka Tiff, the file format. I'm on this panel because I draw cartoon animals kissing each other. You can find me online various places. Well, my website is up there. You can so it's under construction. Let's not talk about it. It's fine. I do small self-published little comic zines. That's my thing. How do I don't have a lot to say about myself.
Hello, my name is Teo Suzuki. I am the co-founder of a small press, kind of more like arts collective, because we all are like individually self-published cartoonists, but we're called Epic Lane Press. And I often will like table and go to indie comic shows and zine fests in like the Northeast. So I primarily operate in non-furry like indie comic and zine spaces, but my work is incredibly furry and is kind of always like an exploration of that, and so are most of my friends. But I guess, yeah, my position in this panel is I have a lot of experience in kind of the broader indie and like alternative comics world, while remaining kind of like committed to making furry art.
They only gave us one mic, so we'll probably be doing this a lot.
Sorry. And I'm Robyn Ruffin. I go by Yaster online. I've also published several independent furry cartoons, similar to Yaster. Yeah, I just thought this would be a good group of people to have. I really appreciate all three of you coming out and taking the time to discuss with me. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Get this to play. All right, so I think I'll kick it off with our first question. How have furry comics impacted you? And do you find that aesthetics critical to your style? You know, like considering how that weighs in with the indie comic scene as a whole. So if anybody has anything to say about that, any thoughts?
And should I just be? I don't.
Let's just.
I don't know
Do you
if we
care
need
if
the
we speak out
microphone.
loud? It's just.
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me all the way in the back?
Are we audible?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We're
Kind
kind
of.
of audible.
We'll
If I
yell.
yell, if I yell
I
a
can
little
project
bit.
my voice a little louder if that makes it easier. But I
I mean, it might be better to have a microphone.
We asked them for 4 mics and they said no. So
That's you can pass it around. That's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, I was thinking about the question, and I think my first like big exposure, because I think like you know, everyone knows that like furry kind of comes from like the roots of like comics and cartoons anyways. You know, I think everyone here has probably read like, you know, Uncle Scrooge comics or like other Disney stuff like that, and you know that definitely played a part in like my exposure to like furriness. But I actually think like the number one like furry comic that inspired me or whatever was I read the Archie Sonic comics a lot when I was a kid. I think I've read, yeah, exactly. I've read, I think all 250 issues of the original run. I think there's like maybe a couple more than that, I don't remember exactly. And I think what impacted me about that, beyond like DuckTales or whatever, is that I think those Archie comics were like really weird and kind of at some points perverse in a way that I think really like helped me bridge the gap between like kind of like funny talking animals as like an aesthetic that's kind of accessible to everyone, and like furriness as this kind of weird niche thing that can make people really uncomfortable, because if you see the way people talk about that comic online, they're like, what were they thinking? And it's like, they were doing it right, and like everything else is like, you know, sterile and like not as interesting. So that was big for me. And then I would say the other thing is like webcomics, like VG Cats and stuff like that, was the other like big foundational like furry work for me, because I think like that was before I started caring about like, you know, Western alternative comics and stuff like that, and like I was already had that foundation built before I even like knew like that I was like a furry explicitly. I was already interested in that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that like that's such an interesting perspective to have, because like, you know, visualizing it as almost this like niche subcultural thing, I think is so critical to what separates a furry work from non-furry work. So no, that's really cool. I kind of had the same experience with like independent furry webcomics, prequel, Flipnote comics growing up. So I've always tried to harbor those aesthetics as well in my works too. I think the modes with which people create their comics is so interesting, and how they put them out there. Because I feel like what really interested me in wanting to self-publish like furry works was actually Flipnote Patena, which is not, you know, a physical media, but you know, it's just a place where it's like you can make whatever you want to and put it out here. And, you know, you see like 10-year-old kids putting out their DIY warrior cats, you know, fan canon flip notes, and you're like, oh, I want to get in on that. How do I get on that? So I think that's very critical. It's just like having the drive to want to make something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if it was strictly comics that got me here. I kind of took a while to get where I am now, and I don't think that I would have believed you if you told me when I was like 15 that I would ever be at a furry convention, especially while talking in a panel about my furry comics. You know, kind of just seeing a lot of scattered influences that made me feel a type of way, specifically surrounding just like, you know, animality and transformation and things like that, which is a very, I would say that's very important to my work, because there's just something about it. There's a juice to that I find rather inspiring. I don't know if there's anything in particular that I would cite relevantly. Like, I mean, you know, I'm sorry. This is my first time talking on a panel. If you can't stop.
I could piggyback back off that if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I probably should have been upfront about this. One of the reasons that I gravitate towards the Archie Sonic comics so much is I do think that provided a bit of a passageway for me into, as Yaster was saying, like transformation stuff, which I think is important to a lot of furries. I mean, like, we literally have like multiple like furry TM comics like on this slideshow behind us, and it's weird because Sonic's already like a furry thing, but like a big part. And this is for me, like, I can't believe I'm saying this in front of like a bunch of people I don't know, but like, what like in the Sonic comics, like a big part of it's like people get like turned into like robots and shit like that, which like really like stuck with me when I was a kid, and like I didn't know what like furry TF was yet. I weirdly didn't play Mystery Dungeon, which is like a lot of people I think cite as like the inspiration, like the like 75 for that. Not for me, weirdly. For me, it was Archie Sonic comics. So like even before like I was on like DeviantArt or anything like that, you know, I was reading comics where like people were turning into whether animals or like, you know, some other thing that isn't human, like some transhumanist like aspect. It's pretty common in comics, both like furry and non-furry, and I think it's important, or it was important for me to like get there, because I might talk about this later. Most of my inspirations now are like more popular like Western alt cartoonists, kind of like Love and Rockets and stuff like that, which is great, but there's no furry TF in Love and Rockets, and I think it was important for me to get exposed to kind of like weird furry web art stuff where shit like that happens like ahead of time. I think it was like a good leveling of it. It's like, okay, let's get this weird stuff in your brain forever, and then you're gonna read the more like formally sophisticated comics.
Yeah, I think for me at least, my kind of main engagement with comics growing up was furry. You know, there wasn't really that much else for me. I mean, you know, there's the kind of, you wouldn't call it furry, but like stuff like the Bone comic series or like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, you know, like that uses animal symbolism and stuff like that, but you know, isn't quite, you know, subculturally maybe considered furry. A lot of that stuff was my inroad. I know we're not like a After Dark panel, but like Smut was huge, obviously.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do a panel on that next year so we can actually like talk about it a little bit more, rather than just alluding to it. But
I can talk about more of my own work.
Exactly. Yeah, right. But yeah, like I guess probably like the majority of us, I'd imagine, I'd always been drawn to this kind of mobilization of, you know, like animality or animal symbolism in the kind of visual or narrative arts, just like broadly. And I guess for me at least, like reflexively, that sort of, I guess like magnetism, for lack of a better word, later became this kind of, you know, concept or affective relation that really intrigued me, to the point where I wanted to like dive deeper into it and like actually study it formally, and kind of try to learn why works that featured animals like resonated so strongly with people. There's kind of this like easy gesture that we often do towards like the ubiquity or presence of animal metaphor and symbolism in like human cultural production, like broadly. Like throughout history, it's like, oh yeah, you know, furry isn't this new thing. It's like any kind of antique or like classical art, you can find examples of like, you know, zoomorphism or stuff like that, anthropomorphism, right? Which is worth noting, right? But I think it's maybe more generative to think about the kind of specific conditions under which certain animals come to be significant to humans at particular places in particular points in time, rather than kind of just generalize outward, because Furry is like particular also. It's not just like the next thing in a line of like human interest in anthropomorphism, right? And I think furry is really interesting in this regard because it's like, even though it comes from this kind of long genealogy of cultural expression and that involves other animals, it's kind of also inflected by these like, sociocultural, sociopolitical, and technological contexts from which it emerges. So like the rise of fandom, or the invention of the internet, the kind of wonder of modern gender expression, but also like climate catastrophe, mass extinctions, and the insidiousness of capitalism and stuff like that. So I think for me at least, furry is like really, I'm drawn to it and kind of animality more generally in my work. For like the transness, like you were saying, like transformation is really important, and I think we can say a lot of really interesting things about gender and animality like combined, and kind of try to deconstruct this idea of like what the human is, or like the human is necessarily separate from the animal, right? But also because I think furry is like kind of uniquely situated to dialogue with the kind of hopes and calamities, I guess you could say, of our contemporary moment. Even as it is bounded or like foreclosed by them in certain ways, I guess you could say.
Yeah, thinking about what my own inspirations would have been. I am glad that you brought up smut, because I wasn't sure if I should talk about that. I think that's something that pulls you in if you're exposed to that. But I just remembered about Dragon Ball. That was a thing. That was a bit of a thing for me as a kid. I remember there was one episode of Dragon Ball Z where Gohan turns into a great ape, and I watched that episode a lot as a child on VHS, and it's interesting to me how much transformation, and especially animal transformation, comes up in things that, a lot of popular things that aren't necessarily, like quote-unquote furry works, where like it's just this element of it that resonates with you. I remember like Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle also being very kind of formative for me, and like germinating that seed in my brain of this kind of element to it of like, kind of losing your humanity a bit, losing control of yourself and becoming something else, becoming something other, becoming something not necessarily greater, but freer in a way, almost.
Yes. I kind of want to bounce off that, actually. Like bouncing off that, I think it's so interesting in a lot of furry works, the concept of the animal as a proxy for yourself. You brought up Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. I was one of those little freak kids who was into that stuff. And I just remember, playing through them as a kid and being like, wow, if I could be whisked away into this like world of being a Pokemon and not having, these human expectations on me, what would I do in that world? What decisions would I be able to make? What can I do with myself? And I think, bringing that mentality into comics work is so interesting. Like, we see so many furry autobio comics specifically, where I feel like writing that character to be an animal makes it easier for you to express yourself. It makes it easier to talk about the hard things, or the really, jubilant things that have happened in your life by creating that proxy. Or even telling an individualized story, telling it with humans can feel a bit self-indulgent sometimes. In like, I don't want to say simplifying it down to being an animal, but like being able to remove it from like the human cultural context, I think can, greatly change the way that somebody writes a story. So I definitely resonate a lot with what you're saying, the aspects of freedom.
I think there's definitely an extent to which we in a way, in like that type of medium, it almost feels like it's a little easier to relate to an animal than it is to a drawing of just some guy.
An animal could be anyone.
An animal could be anyone, but it also is. There's a certain flair to it, and there's a certain I don't know. There's a subconscious primordial appeal, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we'll move on to our next topic then. have you navigated a more traditional comic space? And if so, how was that? You know, did you navigate it with your furry works? Were you working with more quote unquote contemporary stuff? You know, how did that go for you?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I primarily navigate in non-furry, like art and comic scenes. I was saying, like, I've gone to dozens of like indie comic shows and zine fests on the like Northeast, both here and in Canada. And this is like the second furry con I've been to, and the first one was like a month ago. Like, I primarily participate in the non-furry art world, which is something that I was like kind of worried about when I was getting started, because I went to art school and like there's a lot of furries in art school, but like you kind of get the gauge of like what the comics world looks like. And there's, as we're saying, there's like a lot of, you know, furry cartoonists who are, you know, getting exposure and getting, you know, published by like, you know, companies like, you know, Silver Sprocket is a big one, and like there's other smaller ones that are like, you know, getting larger. But even so, like I have like examples of like kind of furry adjacent work by people who like would not call themselves furries, but are putting out anthropomorphic work. Like I have like a slide for like the cartoonist Jason, who's put up by Fantagraphics. Lisa Hannibal, who you guys will probably know from Tuca and Birdie, but she's also like a very prominent alt cartoonist in her own sense. She's published by Drawn Quarterly. I'm so mad because the person sitting in front of us had a Jim Woodring tattoo, and I was gonna point that out because Jim Woodring is another, like, I would say non-furry who puts out like anthropomorphic, like funny animal cartoons under the like more famous alternative comics publishers. My point is that when I was like entering the art space of like, you know, the Western indie comic worlds, I was like kind of aware that my work was a lot more like visibly furry and like explicitly furry than like everyone else, and in a way that like I was kind of expecting to get some sort of pushback, because people would be like, whoa, this is like weird or whatever. Sorry, I just pointed out your Jim Woodring tattoo. I'm sorry. Because I just listed it as an example of how there's a lot of, I think, non-furries in kind of like Western alt comic spaces who like put out funny animal work. That like, I don't know how much of an overlap there is between like, you know, like the furry fandom and artists like Jim Woodring. Clearly there's some, because you're right in front of me. But, you know, I was just mentioning that. Anyways, I have been lucky to find that whenever I go to shows, there's like no pushback at all. Like every time I'm worried or like I'm like embarrassed or like, you know, kind of like feel like some like shame that like I'm presenting my like weird furry comic to people, like I always kind of expect there to be some pushback, and like there never is. You know, like non-furries, like very normal people will like accept it pretty open-handedly, which I think makes me optimistic. And I think the anecdote I can end that on is like one of the more rising stars in like alternative comics right now is there's a small press called Cram Books. They just got nominated for multiple Ignatz Awards, which is the most prestigious indie comic award, I would say. And I have the pleasure of knowing the guy who runs it. His name's Andrew Alexander, and one of the first times I was talking to him, I was flipping through one of his press's compilations, and I just like flip onto it, and there's like a random Paul Peng like comic like in the magazine, and I like was shocked because I'd like only seen his work in like furry spaces, and I was like, oh my god, it's a Paul Peng comic. And Andrew Alexander, who I do not believe is a furry and does not talk to furries, was looking at me, he's like, oh yeah, like he's great. So it gave me hope and like be like, okay, we're at like a point where even if it's like primarily a non-furry space, like kind of weird, like niche specific furriness is, I think, more widely accepted in like non-furry comic spaces, which I think is good, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah, please.
Oh my gosh, speaking about Paul,
Yeah.
a little bit
Did I
off
mispronounce
topic.
it? Oh, I'm sorry.
But speaking of the room party
Yeah.
last month in Pittsburgh, that was crazy. Speaking of curated spaces for artists, it's kind of incredible that we as a community can like come together and create spaces that are not only, you know, interesting to us and like the things that we like, but we can also elevate our work into more contemporary spaces. I think I believe at their peak they had like 600 something people come through on one of the on the opening night, and most of those were just people on the street. Yeah, for those who don't know, Room Party is a independent furry gallery done in Pittsburgh. It was during June and July during Anthrocon, and they had, I believe, 60 independent furry artists presenting work there, as well as performance artists, video artists. So it was kind of a huge deal, biggest one that's ever happened. And knowing that just the general public is willing to engage with that is kind of amazing. And knowing that independent furry publishers can like create an audience of people who are outside of the fandom as well is very inspiring. So I don't know. I just wanted to mention that. I thought it was really cool.
Yeah. For me, maybe not, comic specific, but I can probably, speak to academic publishing a little bit, which is kind of one of the most traditional and old school, venues of publication, I guess you could say. It's largely text oriented, so it really depends on the discipline, but primarily, the written pieces. And kind of combined with the realities of peer review and trying to get published and that whole process, as well as the kind of relatively conservative structure of the academy. Historically, it's made getting published for more quote unquote fringe topics a bit annoying, or stuff that's not deemed rigorous or acceptable in a traditional sense or in the eyes of certain scholarly communities or stuff like that. But it largely depends on the kind of specific discipline you're working in, like I said, or specific publishing organizations that you're going after. And luckily, at least in the humanities where I am, it's been changing kind of drastically in the past few decades. There's been an explosion of smaller independent publishing venues, smaller journals or online or open access publications that have more freedom in what they put out. And so I think now, kind of bouncing off what y'all were saying, there's a really interesting kind of sphere, or I guess potential for getting stuff out there and in non-furry spaces in a way that there wasn't maybe before. And it's, in my experience, it's very doable. You just have to kind of look in the right place. You're not going to be able to push things out everywhere. You just have to find the places you can put it out. For example, my home field is, at least departmentally speaking, it's musicology or music history, which as far as the arts and humanities fields go is pretty conservative actually. So it can be difficult to transparently put stuff out that, the powers that be say don't fit the, constraints of the discipline or whatever. But in reality, much of the work I do is very, interdisciplinary and kind of falls outside of what would be traditionally understood as musicology or ethnomusicology or whatever. So I just look elsewhere, anthropology, trans studies, animal studies, performance studies, stuff like that, are really hospitable to kind of whatever. And it basically just boils down to how well you can couch the work you're trying to publish in the theoretical languages of the disciplines you're looking in. So as long as you can cite the right people and weave that kind of bullshit. It's not bullshit obviously, but you have to speak the language just a little bit to get funding, and then you can do whatever you want basically. And more DIY avenues are popping up all the time, like Room Party, which a lot of people kind of have a mix of academic or more work that is in non-academic spaces. The boundaries, honestly, for a lot of practitioners of the arts are blurred a lot of the time. And especially kind of the smaller or younger academic disciplines, like trans studies or animal studies, for example, are really welcoming to these kind of things that would not be accepted maybe elsewhere. And generally it's fields with a lot of marginalized people that are really hospitable to this sort of thing. Obviously, the radical or the weird, the stuff that is often pushed aside, that's kind of the forefront of a lot of these disciplines. The main difficulties, I might say, would be full-length books, which again, not comics. There's actually, I've seen a bunch of different kind of furry comics published in Transgender Studies Quarterly, for example. So it's in a university press journal published publication, which is kind of awesome. But like the kind of single author monograph that is like the gold stamp of like, oh, to get like tenure to prove that you like are a certified academic, you have to like publish your book, right? That's a bit harder to do, but again, I think the landscape is changing. Yeah.
I have like one final, but you should say
Should I say something?
if you don't want, I was just like.
I mean, yeah. I mean, this kind of gets me thinking about the way that I mean, there's sort of a disconnect, isn't there, between what I think the general public outside of the fandom thinks of as furry and a lot of the stuff that is just already here and that we're making and that connects with us, that is like, it very much often does come from outside. And it's kind of just like we're, I don't know, kind of pushing through, getting almost like accepted as a sort of identity, as a community, but like it's like we're making real, meaningful, valuable art that that people outside of the fandom can appreciate and see the value in, and it's words escape me, but I think you got the gist of what I was trying to say.
So I was going to add like one final thing, because I was kind of piggybacking on all of it, as far as like acceptance and kind of like people being open to furry art. I think you're right that it does depend on like where you're looking, and I think that sometimes I'll surprise myself because like you'll mention like furriness to like a random person, and like they have like a really like averse negative reaction to it, and you're like, oh right, like I forgot that like that's normal or whatever. But I think the nice thing about comics is that comics is already such like a kind of nerdy, kind of outcasted like sect of like the arts and culture already. So I think there's like pretentious people in comics, but I think most people who care about comic books like understands like that it's kind of like weird and like lame or whatever, which I think makes them have more respect and like understanding for furry work, even if they're not a furry. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I've submitted my work to like 2 different review like publications. Like one was there's like a column in the Comics Journal that covers self-published work, and one is a fanzine called Bubbles. These are both like not famous, but if you care about indie comics, you're gonna know about them. And I sent my work, and I kind of expected them to not like it, but they both reviewers kind of covered it like with a mostly positive, while they both went out of their way to be like, oh, we know that like furries are really important for comics or whatever. Like they're like, they're both like historians, they're like, they're scholars of like alternative comics. So like you don't really have to justify furriness to those people, because they're like, listen, like we're all like, I've been here, I know what furries are, I understand how important it is. And it almost felt like they were like clarifying. They were like, before I give my opinion, just know that I'm all for this. I think this is cool or whatever. And it was encouraging because one of the reviews was like pretty positive. Like the nicest compliment that the reviewer gave me was like, oh, it's like pretty good or whatever, right? And I just emailed this person recently because I'm making my 2nd issue of my comic, and I wanted to put a blurb on the back of like, hey, and so I messaged him like, hey, is it okay if I like quote you saying that my comic's like pretty good on the back of my book? And he responded like, yes, of course. And shockingly, he was like, hey, you should like send me the 2nd issue like when it's done, which I was not expecting because I didn't think he liked it that much. But like clearly, he cares and is like invested in it, even if he's not a furry himself. And I think that's interesting and worth a note.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, again, like what I was talking about. There's that kind of disconnect between how people see us as a community and the extent to which anthropomorphism and like, quote unquote furry things are ingrained in popular culture. Just
Yeah, and I think that kind of naturally segues us into our next question. I wanted to ask how you all have built your network of like non-furry and other furry artists and people who are engaging with your work on a deeper level, and what that's meant to you. I kind of want to, for first, I can say the three of us have connected a lot through the Athenaeum comics mentorship program, which has been really cool. And I think there are a lot of avenues through which you can meet people that way. I know a lot of the people that I personally have met in comics have been people who I've co-worked with on zines like Union, K-Fuzz, Furry BIPOC zine, just things like that, and shooting your shot into a bunch of projects, and really collaborating with people and them has been hugely instrumental, and making sure to actually cultivate those connections and talk to those people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, social media has been obviously kind of super helpful. It's great, for finding other artists that, you vibe with or want to work with or are interested in their work. Personally, I try not to be super active online. I really try not to be on there too much. But even just having a space or a page or a website or whatever is always great for people to they can go to and reach out to you, or you can reach out to them or stuff like that. And for me, that's mostly on the furry side. On the academic side, it's a bit different. Social media is still pretty helpful. I know there are a lot of social media circles. People post conferences, publications, stuff like that all the time. And then I'm in a little group chat of other furry academics too, so that's really helpful in kind of seeing what everybody's doing, for example. But for more quote unquote non-furry stuff, I meet a lot of people through formalized events, either in-person conferences, word of mouth, through colleagues, email listservs or websites or stuff like that. And cold emailing works really well for academics specifically. I mean, for people in general, I think too. But a lot of the time, scholars have especially in the humanities, they have so few people actually reading their work that most people will happily respond if you just email them. You read an article or a book and you really like it and you're oh my god, and you just email the person and say, hey, loved your book. And then so many times I've done that just because I wanted to show appreciation for their work. 3 months later, I'm on a panel with them at a conference or something. That's kind of how it works a lot of the time. But broadly, the most fruitful stuff definitely comes from in-person interactions, right? After the kind of reach out via whatever virtual means, getting to learn from others and listen to how they think about their work and navigate what they're doing is really kind of the most rewarding part of it. At the end of the day, you just have to talk to people, and then you'll find stuff. You just obviously tactfully and respectfully, you don't just want to spam someone, but most people just love to share about their stuff. And I know networking is kind of maybe a nasty term, and you shouldn't just do it to do it, if that makes sense. But I find just kind of genuinely approaching people with an ethos of care and curiosity, and kind of a desire to listen, really yields the best results. And then you make friends, and then you keep doing stuff, and then you find people through those friends. And so yeah, it's mostly community. Community is really, really important. It's kind of feet on the ground, talking to people, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think also, obviously, social media is a big part of it. That's sort of how I got into it. I'm a natural introvert, so that's just where I started off. But, you grow a little bit and you make connections with other artists. I met Robyn on Twitter, I think. And I ran into you in person, and that was fun. But yeah, it's been really nice that that does then get you out into more event stuff like this, but also just art marts and local zine fairs around town, the only doing Clark Park every it's the last Sunday of the month, right? Yeah, just going there and just meeting other artists just as people, and they come to your table and you go to their table and you just talk about your work and swap zines and stuff like that, and just make real life meet space connections.
I'm trying to remember the question really quickly. Sorry. yeah, for me, I actually think it's a bit of the inverse of what people are saying, as in, I really don't think social media played a much large role in my career as an independent cartoonist at all. I really didn't have much of a social media following until less than a year ago, just under a year ago, which I'm very happy about because you post something the number goes up and you're like, wow, it's a big number, which is great. But I think for me, it's very much, as we're speaking, taking the initiative to reach out to people in real life spaces. Robyn mentioned that we met through kind of a mentorship thing that Remy Woydell organizes with Anathema. And the reason that I'm involved in that is because I went to a comic show called the Toronto Comics Arts Festival, which I'm wearing a shirt of right now, which is awesome. And it was in 2022, I was, I believe, 20 years old. And Remy had a table there, and Remy was an artist who I admired. So I kind of brought a couple copies of my first self-published book, just to give out to artists I liked. So, I walked up to her table and I was like, hey, I like your work. I'm going to give this book to you as a gift. And something that immediately stuck out to me that was very nice was that the other two people I did that with were like, oh, thanks, and they took it, right? Nothing wrong with that, right? But Remy offered to trade my book for something, which was very kind, because I was like, oh, that means it's worth something, which is cool. And then I proceeded to not talk to Remy for 2 years because we didn't know each other. But I went to that same show 2 years after, and she was there again, and I made another book, and I was like, do you want to trade again? And she was like, yeah. So then we did, and then a couple months later, Remy reached out to me and was like, hey, do you want to give a presentation for this mentorship thing that I'm doing? And I was like, of course. And that's how that happened. I don't believe that I would have ever befriended Remy online, really. I think I'm actually kind of bad at online interactions, and I often spent my younger years looking at Twitter artists of 70,000 followers, and I'm like, how the fuck do you even do that? I don't understand. And I've found much more luck by going to real spaces and just introducing myself to people, giving them a book if I want to, and it has multiple times been a good positive experience where either I'll become friends with them, or if not, they just know who I am, and then when I show up to the next show and they're like, oh, it's you. And I'm like, that's great. But that's something that's kind of weird, I think, because I think for furries, I mean, this content is great, but I think furries is also a really online space in a way that American indie comics is not. If you are not showing up to the smaller, small press shows, you're just gonna have no idea what's happening. And it's kind of I don't want to say closed off in that sense, but it definitely is a community that rewards you for showing up to places in person. And I'm very lucky to, I live in New York, it's very easy for me to get to a bunch of different shows. But I do think for me, participating in the comics world does involve me frequently showing up to stuff. I don't feel like I'm one of those artists that can just that's not me. I'm not an artist who can kind of work by myself in a room and then post stuff and it gets cultural traction or whatever. I think a big part of making a name for yourself is showing up to places and talking to people and hanging out and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that really is kind of the meta. I mean, literally the most recent shop I've put my comics in is literally because I went to the Black Comics, Brooklyn Zine Fest, and you were like, you should come to this. This would be really good for you. There's Philly people there, so. But moving along, how do you view more successful furry works? How do you feel about the reach that they have, and how do you want to try and integrate those? I don't know, kind of processes into your own work.
I know, I feel
I can hear you say stuff.
Really talking a lot.
I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, we love it. This is a discussion. Please talk. So I guess on the question of mainstream success in furry. I'm kind of torn on this because like part of me, like probably a lot of people, like I want my work to have an impact on like a structural level. Like that's kind of why I do a lot of the things I do. I want like to give people the opportunity to like think about things in new ways that they haven't maybe thought about things before. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of value in this kind of niche intercommunal work, especially in response to this kind of, I guess, like increasing pressure to commodify furry, and especially as like furry has entered mainstream cultural consciousness over like the past 2 decades or so. It's always been in places, like Yaster saying, like there's always been like a conception of furry, right, in the mainstream. But I think now we're increasingly seeing like people who kind of get it a little bit more, even if they're not a part of those kind of scenes. And particularly when you're like trans or, kind of otherwise marginalized, I think it's really important and sometimes even like very necessary to kind of go against this impulse to make things like palatable to external audiences just for the sake of being palatable, right? And that's not to say like success automatically equals palatability, and everyone has their own like, goals and aspirations and stuff like that. But for me, I'm probably mostly concerned about just saying like what I want to say in the ways I want to say it, if that makes sense. And that's kind of a naive outlook, but I'd like to, kind of hold that ideal as long as I can. Because mainly I just want to dialogue with my, like trans animal kin, and then also kind of be accountable to like the other animals who we like draw so much of our like cultural expression and cachet. That kind of comes first. So like in my research, I'm really, and in my kind of creative practice, I really want to like think about how furry or therian or whatever relates to kind of the like real material relations between humans and other species. Especially now in this kind of like calamitous kind of age of mass extinction, right? Factory farming, etc. But to make a living is kind of a different outlook, right? And sometimes you have to compromise in places, obviously, to like secure funding or have that book deal or whatever. And that really all depends on your circumstances. You get your bag. You gotta like do what you have to do. Personally, I'm not like interested in being like anything, like selling anything. So I'm like luckily I'm in a position where like, at least right now, I don't know how long this will last, where my income isn't dependent on the type of work I do specifically. Obviously, like I'm saying things to funding agencies, but like the actual work I do is the work I'd like to do most of the time. But then another kind of like, I guess, important caveat to that is that, you can do work for different audiences. You don't have to just do work for like an audience, broadly, right? Like an academic article is like very different from like a DIY trans furry lesbian zine, for example. And they don't have to be like distinct things. They can still be like you working out your ideas or expressing whatever you want to express. But for me, I think the forms that my work takes largely depends on the audiences I want to reach. And different audiences require different approaches. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're creating things, like whatever they are, right? So who do you want to reach with your work, and why is a very important question to ask, I think. And your answers to that question should affect your process in some way, though obviously the degree to which they actually do, differs, and it's really kind of contingent on what you want to do with your work, basically.
Yeah, me personally, I'm obviously like a bit, like part of it is just, again, sort of skepticism and being a little bit wary of commodification and just like, because that is the thing that we're starting to see a little bit. But for me, I don't know, not to say this in a kind of like, exclusive or what's the word? I don't know. Yeah, a gatekeeping type of way. I appreciate furry as a thing that we make for each other a lot, and I would like to be, have a little bit more like quote unquote success and be able to make a little bit more of a living off of what I do. But I like having a niche audience. I like it being that I'm making these dirty little things in my room, in my little home studio, and I'm distributing them among my friends and my peers at wherever we happen to meet. And I have a zine on me. It's like, have you read this? Would you like to read this? Awesome. I ran into somebody at the Long Island Retro Games Expo that I went to a couple of weeks ago, and we had to talk about comics and stuff, because it's also the nature of what I do kind of means that I have to be a little bit niche. I don't want to put euphemisms on it. It's like I draw porn. That's what I do, and that's not really something that's mainstream, palatable, marketable, what have you. I make I make advertiser unfriendly work. I make credit card company unfriendly work a lot of the time. So yeah, I think that being niche is something that not only I enjoy and is very valuable to me, because it's like what support I have gotten and what success I have gotten is from a community of people.
Before I answer, I just wanted to say, actually, I think Juniper made a really good point about furry accountability that I've never really considered before, about kind of how we are mistreating animals on such a global scale. And I'm just kind of obsessed with the concept that furries are committing a cultural appropriation of real animals. And I think that's wonderful, because it's true. Concept of someone wearing a cow fursuit going to McDonald's or something like that. And it's that is actually something we should think about. I didn't want that note to go underlined, because I think that was a really good point. Anyways, to answer the actual question, I kind of want to present the flip side to what I was talking about a second ago, about how indie comics in the West are so small and so niche and in person. I've kind of gotten over it now, but for a while I kind of had a gripe about that, because I felt sometimes I'd go to a comic show and the comics would be so niche, they're just so obviously for the other people at this comic show, where I thought to myself okay, what are we doing or whatever. I get that having an insular community is good and helpful, but I think sometimes I'll read comics that run the risk of being so kind of inside baseball-y in a way that it's really it feels like people are just making it to impress other people at the same comic shows. And I think that it's just not the motive I'm interested in making art. I have always been, of course, to not sacrifice the furry aesthetic or philosophy. I have always liked to think that I am making work that could be kind of grabbed upon by a stranger. And again, over time I've kind of warmed up to making stuff and giving it to people and having a kind of friend to friend dialogue about it. But I think when I didn't have a lot of cartoonist friends, I really kind of romanticized this idea of I want to make something that a stranger could find and they would love it. I idolized there's an indie musician named Alex G. And the thing I liked the most about him growing up was that he wasn't, at least to my knowledge, he wasn't a big community guy. He just hung out with his friends, and then he put his albums on Bandcamp, and he became incredibly famous because the work spoke for itself on such a level that random people who would have never met were just holy shit, I'm gonna tell everyone about this. Which I don't think is how, I'm not saying that's how it should be done, but I like that idea that you can make work that can connect to people without you really having to do anything except making the work. That doesn't necessarily mean I want to be uber famous. I know I have a slide of Fritz the Cat on here, and that people, kind of to speak on I think Robyn was talking about how more mainstream furry stuff can be like kind of like commodified and like, you know, like the edges can be sanded off, which, you know, people talk about how like first the cat couldn't be made today or whatever, which I think is true. I think, you know, I'm slightly optimistic in the sense that like, you know, listen, say what you will, but like Has-Been Hotel is not exactly like MasterCard sponsored material. Like, you know, like one of the most incredibly popular like furry adjacent media out right now is like clearly has not gone through any sort of like corporate like diluting or whatever. So that's good, but I don't know if I want to be like Vivzy Pop famous. I think my ideal level of fame would be how like when the Danganronpa video games came out, people would like repost it on Tumblr and be like, what the fuck are they doing? That's kind of what I would like as far as like strangers interacting with my work on a mass level.
That's such a good, yeah, I feel similarly about like the middle kind of level of like, yeah, the people who you want to care about your work recognize you, but you don't have to deal with the crazy, you know, kind of quote unquote fame, right? But like also bouncing off your point about the, you know, you're talking about the insularity of like certain spaces. I see like a very similar thing in academic spaces where it's like, you know, the nature of, especially like smaller disciplines, like it depends, you know, again, it depends on your discipline kind of dramatically, but like most of the time you're talking to like 5 to 10 people in the world who can like know what you're talking about because it's like, you know, so theoretically dense or whatever, which can be kind of demoralizing because you're like, oh, I pour my heart and soul into like this thing, and you know, and then you go to like a conference and it's literally like everybody in the world who is doing this thing is at this conference and you're just talking to each other and it's great, but then you're like, okay, what do I do outside of this, right? And I think this presents like an interesting dilemma for like furry stuff, because like I write on like furry theory and like animal stuff all the time. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, it's nice like talking to academics, but then it's also like, it feels kind of hollow to do the work, and then like I want people in the community to also read the work, which I think for me is also why I'm drawn to like very different modalities or like ways of presenting the work. Because, you know, you want to do something for one audience and then you have to like transpose it or translate it for a different audience. So that's always been a thing that I try to like, I'm like constantly trying to figure out how to navigate, is like how to like do the stuff that's like really, I think really like cool and, you know, like philosophical or whatever you want to call it, on a level that's like not inaccessible as well, because that's I think a really big problem in academia in general.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly real. I'm also still just kind of locked in on the Danganronpa. But no, I think yeah, that kind of middle realm, just, you know, acknowledgement from your peers, I think is kind of the most beautiful part about the indie comic space as a whole. We're running a little bit short on time here, so I'm gonna start wrapping us up. I'll open up for questions now. There's not another panel here until 1, so feel free to stick around, ask more questions. But I'm gonna go with you in the back first. You with the pink collar.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned very beginning when you were introducing your academic work, one of the anxieties you talked about wasn't just animal versus human, but you said how this weighs on animate versus inanimate. I want to hear about that. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, okay, so there's a strain of, I guess you could call it like new materialist philosophy. I might get a little in the weeds here.
That's okay.
But that, you know, there was a big trend in like the 2000s in this kind of academic space where, you know, people were really interested in like thinking about how objects can have agency even if they may not be considered like traditionally alive. So like, you know, this table, even though it's not like, you know, organic or alive in the sense that we would maybe like want to say it or like traditionally want to say it is, it's like it's making me do certain things. Like I can't go through it, you know, it's making me sit in this particular way, you know, it's exerting influence on the things around it. So like that's one part of it where like for me specifically, if I'm looking at fur, fur lies on this really weird kind of continuum of aliveness and deadness where, you know, it's like on one hand it's like skin from someone, like seriously, and you know, and then through all these kind of like violent processes it gets turned into something that's like dead, right? So that kind of process and also dichotomy is something I'm interested in like exploring in my work. But also, and a big critique of a lot of the stuff that I was mentioning before in like new materialist philosophy spheres is that like, you know, the kind of live-dead dichotomy is also a very like Western or colonial one, in the sense that like other cultures may not necessarily see like on that same continuum, right? Things can have lives that are not just like, you know, things that, you know, we in the US like think are organic, right? Like in a lot of indigenous cosmologies especially too, there's this kind of idea of like, and again, it's specific, you know, it's specific on tribe and culture and stuff like that, obviously. But, you know, death is just like this kind of threshold of sorts that then, you know, different things are happening depending on what kind of cosmology you're subscribing to, right? So yeah, so that's what I'm thinking of, specifically in the context of like fur, which is so fraught in like kind of, is it living, is it dead? A lot of the kind of like erotic purchase of fur in like, you know, the fetishization of it as like an object, actually depends on the kind of death making that's like entwined in, you know, entwined in the very violent process of like fur farming, for example, if that makes sense.
I have a question. Actually, it involves the niche aspect you were talking about. So I do like abstract art, and I consider myself an outsider like in the furry fandom. I do love furry art, but I'm trying to get my foot in the door with the style. And I just feel like an outsider no matter what kind of style I'm trying to get into. Like maybe any advice for that, or if you guys relate, anything like that.
I don't know if I have any, you know, directly helpful advice for you, but just thinking in terms of my own experience, I have also kind of felt sort of like, I don't know, in the beginning I wasn't really sure if what I did was like furry art, you know, because there is like very much a certain style to like what is, you know, popularly thought of as furry art. But I don't know, I think just doing something that's like Teo was talking about, just like letting the work speak for itself, you know. I make what I make, and it connects with people in a certain way. It's like I'm not like, obviously, you know, it's furry. It's, you know, that is partly an aesthetic choice that I make that lets me be here talking to you now. But you know, I don't think it's so much about like chasing a style to like fit in. It's yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
sorry if that's not.
It's kind of like expressing yourself in the furry style while maintaining yourself in your artistic design, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, talking about like, also talking about like not making things like inside baseball, but like, you know, there is a power in uniqueness and specificity that gives it its own appeal. Or like, you know, you're not trying to be broad, you're not trying to do something to appeal to people. You are doing what you do, and that attracts the people that appreciate that, what you're doing.
Yeah. Well spoken.
This is mostly, again, like addressing like more like broader American indie comics than like furry specifically. But I think, you know, you might be in luck because I feel like, at least right now in like indie scenes, I think like art comics and avant-garde comics are getting a lot more popular these days. There's like things called art book fairs, which is like, you know, zines of comics are welcome, but that's really for the space for people who, you know, really want to kind of approach the book and like the zine, the self-published zine, as like an art piece. And I'll go to these shows and there's a lot of like really abstract, kind of, like boundary pushing stuff that I think is very cool and interesting. They typically cost a lot more than a self-published zine, so I'm not exactly buying them all the time, but I like looking at them when they're in the shows. And I guess I'm just saying, like I totally get feeling like an outsider, but I actually do think, I think maybe like in the 80s and 90s, like alt comics had a real like traditional, like formalist approach to it, because everyone really, really wanted to be, I don't know, they want to be like Gasoline Alley and Winsor McKay or whatever. And I think nowadays people are much more inspired by avenues like outside of comics, which has led to some really interesting visual work. And I think I'm sure there's going to be an art book fair of some kind in Philly, like within the month, and you can just go there, and I'm sure you'll find people who you find yourself having things in common with.
Thank you.
That actually kind of reminded me of the stuff that Pearl does, actually. Pearl Cruz, one of the artists that's also in the Anatheum mentorship group, who is like a comic artist but does very abstract, sort of, impressionistic representations of like the body and like transformation and visuals. I would look into. I would recommend looking into her stuff too. I think it's really great. They're Pearl Cruz. I don't know if they're.
It's like
Chopson, yeah, Chopson, Chopsyn.
Good artist.
Yeah, great
And
stuff.
Maybe I can speak, because I also don't make like traditionally furry stylistic art, I guess. And I think too, like, furry is so broad at this point, like, you really cannot offer a clean definition of like what it is, or like aesthetically what it encompasses. I think I'm not really interested in that kind of definition either. Like, I make a lot of like when I do stuff on like paper, it's like I scribble with highlighters and they're like shapes and stuff. They're not like, traditionally like what you think of when you think of furry art, right? But like it is very furry, if that makes sense. And I see a lot of other people in these kind of similar spaces as well, where it's like the art they're kind of trying to make is like very heavily, influenced and coming from that place. But like it doesn't map on cleanly to like, funny animals or whatever, which I think is fine. Audience, like building an audience is the harder part, and I do not have any advice about that. But yeah, just do what speaks to you in the way it like processes, I think, what's really important. And you'll get people who like see stuff in your work, that eventually it'll just come. But okay. So there's another panel coming in actually. So we have to vacate the premises. We'll be around though, we can talk in the hallway if people still have questions. Thank you all for coming out. This is awesome. Yeah, thank you.
It's recess.
I felt like such a real adult for not checking my phone the entire time. I was like, my phone right now. But I have like your great. Can I do one more final note?
Yeah, I have one final note really quickly. I was telling an anecdote about how I like going to shows and trading and stuff. I have a very limited supply of my comics in my bag, and if anyone here has a zine or comic that they'd like to trade with me, I'm open to do that in the hallway, as we were saying right now.
Yes. I'm so. Yeah, I did. You were gone for like 5 seconds. And like,
She just asked. There definitely are. I'm not a student of comics, like the others, I think, but I think it's for in my experience, it's like a combination.
I feel bad. I
find out
have
a
to
lot about
admit that I haven't read it
stuff
just between
online, and
comics
then
I feel like I'm one of those guys where like my knowledge of the comics world far exceeds like what I've actually sat down and read. But yes, of course I know who Juniper is.
I like to get stuff.
Yeah. What's your other test?
Not really, no.
Is it just